Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 AGM for the NPA Sydney Region Branch, along with a special presentation by our guest, Professor David Lindenmayer. To start with, I'd just like to acknowledge elders past and present from all of the lands in which we join this meeting from across New South Wales, and in particular Gayamagal country, where I'm on here in Manly, and a special acknowledgement for the Durrell peoples, for which I have a deep connection. To start with, we've got a video introduction from one of our committee members who's not able to be here, Emily Rowland, and I'll just commence that video now.
Hello Sydney! For those who don't know me, I'm Emily Rowland, a member of the NPA Sydney Regional Branch, but currently overseas on a semester exchange studying at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Although I am unable to attend tonight's meeting, regardless, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our very special guest, Professor David Lindenmayer. Not only has he written 49 books around forest conservation, and I know there are many members interested around this topic, he is also one of Australia's top 50 scientists. We are very, very lucky to have him share some of his expertise tonight, particularly from his latest books, Forest Wars, drawing from his 41 years of research and evidence. His book sheds light on the devastating impacts of native forest logging, from the destruction of ecosystems, increased bushfire risks, and the harm to our beautiful wildlife. His insights are invaluable for anyone concerned with conservation, and I know that is all of us. This is a very rare opportunity to hear directly from one of the leading voices in environmental science, and we are very grateful for you, Professor David Lindenmayer, to join us tonight at our meeting. I'm really looking forward to hearing all about it, and please join me in welcoming Professor David Lindenmayer. Bye!
Great to have Emily involved in the committee here in Sydney. She's a very dynamic individual, very active in marine conservation and advocacy space. And amongst many of the other things that she does, she's an ambassador for Ocean Youth. So now I'd like to hand over to David and we'll begin the presentation.
Forest Wars. This is a book, and I'm going to talk about some of the myths in the book as they relate to what's happening in New South Wales, but also elsewhere in Australia, because some of the themes are actually very pertinent to what's happening right now in New South Wales. So I actually started doing this work for this book in July 1983. And I'm disguised here as a much younger man in front of you. And a lot of what the book's about is based on data collection, actually real world measurements of trees and plants and animals. So I want you to think back to 1983. There was really no serious satellite data available at that stage. There was no what we call meta-analysis across different issues. There was almost no legislation to prevent land clearing. Land care hadn't really kicked off at this stage. We're establishing plantations around southern New South Wales by clearing native forests and elsewhere in New South Wales. And export wood chipping at Eden was in full swing, and it looked like this. So this is a series of logging coops in the Eden woodchip concession area, where the logging coops together are areas of 5 kilometres by 5 kilometres and sometimes even larger. Now, one of the consequences of this is that the composition of the forest has been radically altered by these kinds of activities, and we'll come back to that in a later stage in the talk. But if we think about 1983, climate change wasn't being talked about. There was no discussion of ecosystem collapse. You know, the term biodiversity wasn't even invented by that stage, and the ideas of mass biodiversity loss weren't recognised. There was no idea that these drivers of decline, climate change and fire, might interact. The term ecosystem services hadn't even been developed at that stage. Wildfires in our landscapes are always a big surprise. The term First Nations hadn't even been developed then, and there was certainly no sense of First Nations people working on country. So if we move forward to 1997, now this is a very important time because Some people might recognize the good-looking gentleman in the middle, and his name is Robert Hill. And here he is out in the forest with myself and the local Member of Parliament in Victoria, Fran Bailey. And we're talking about the regional forest agreements. And I call this Brandolini's law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle, because Robert Hill told me that the RFAs were going to solve the forest wars. They were going to deliver certainty to the timber industry. The timber industry was going to be economically prosperous, and we were going to save all those endangered species. And this could be myth 1A in the book, but it's not. But it's really interesting. By 2023, Robert Hill has actually signed a pledge to end native forest logging. He recognises that it's a basket case. So let's roll forward now to 2024. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was this. So we have the 4 riders of the apocalypse, and now we've got a 5th one, and that's misinformation. And, you know, myth 1B could be this. This comes from an upper house politician in Victoria, that I subvert the peer review process. So I did a little check by Professor Google just a few minutes ago, and this could have been myth 1B. This is the number of citations to our work, all sorts of other metrics. We're the most highly cited forest ecologists on the planet. Forest Wars book's really about exposing the key myths in forestry. And this is really important because there's a lot of myths that go with the industry, and there's a lot of science and economics that's involved in the myth busting. And I really wanted to be able to arm people with the ability to push back against all the myths that are perpetrated in this system. Okay, so the first myth that I think is really important, and I learnt this when I was doing undergraduate forestry in 1981 and 82, is that there's no effects of logging on biodiversity. The trees grow back, the animals move away, they move back again, forest grows, it's all fine. Well, the reality is that that's not true. And here's a photo of yours truly looking very grumpy, in this case in Tasmania, standing on a single tree stump that was cut just weeks before. So this is in May 2024. It's hard to believe we're still cutting forests like this. This would be a 550-year-old tree. But these effects of logging are instant. The animals die on site. And then the effect of logging can be up to 200 years and probably longer, because that's the amount of time that it takes to start to grow trees to a stage where they've got hollows and some of the other features that animals need them. So how do we know this? Well, we know this because people have actually studied it, including ourselves. We know that the animals actually die where they live. Very few of them move away. Some birds do, but most don't. Logging is occurring in very high conservation value forests, and this is true in New South Wales. The average area targeted for logging in New South Wales supports up to 8 threatened species. So logging is occurring in the most important areas for biodiversity in your forests. And there are what we call cumulative effects of adding more and more logging coops to the landscape year after year. So this is part of where I work. I do much of my work in Victoria, but we could be in Eden, as we saw in one of those earlier photographs. And each one of these little white polygons shows the location of a logging coop in a landscape where another piece is cut out of the landscape. And we know what happens cumulatively because we've got study sites in a number of areas where the landscape is increasingly cut over. And so there are cumulative effects on biodiversity. The more logging there is in the landscape, the fewer species of possums and gliders we're likely to see, the fewer species of birds we're likely to see. Now, the second myth is really important as well. The background here is the fires in 2009 in Victoria, and those flame heights are about 70 metres on top of 60-metre tall trees. And there's a yellow-tailed black cockatoo flying through there. This is truly a scary time when you've got flames that are 140 metres tall. Now, the thinking has been, well, we need to log our forests because that'll make them safe. They won't burn as badly. But the science actually shows that logged forests that are logged and regenerated are actually more flammable. So this is in part due to a change in climate. We know that climate's a key driver of fire, but it's also due to logging, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But there's also a signal that's showing that hazard reduction burning in some vegetation types is also making forests more flammable. And what we see is that the highest severity fires are in this young to intermediate age forest. So we can see here in the little graph, this is the probability of canopy fire on this axis, and this is the age of the forest on this axis. And there's a pulse of flammability that lasts about 40 years before the forest starts to become less and less flammable as time goes on, with the least flammability being in forests that are about 200 to 300 years old. So we can actually look further at this and we can unpack this and we can see a logging effect quite clearly in the data. And what we see is that young log forests are highly flammable and then they reburn at very high severity. So these results were first found in Victoria. We can see these references in the top line, but people have now started to see this in southwestern Western Australia, Tasmania, and in New South Wales. Work in New South Wales and Victoria. I'm going to talk about that briefly in a moment. But elsewhere overseas, South America, Canada, Western North America, and the list goes on. And it includes not just forests and wet forests, but also woodlands and plantations. So this is something that is very close to many people's hearts here. So what we see in this little diagram is the probability of canopy damage in a fire in relation to whether the forest is intact or undisturbed versus whether it's logged, and in relation to what we call a forest fire danger index. So the green represents conditions that are very mild for fire. The orange represents moderate fire danger, the forest fire danger index, and the red is very high or extreme. And what we see in this graph is that, not surprisingly, you're more likely to get severe canopy damage under high forest fire danger index. But we see that forests that have been logged are always burning at higher severity than intact forest. And the summary of that little diagram is that log forests always burn at higher severity, but the effect is so substantial that log forests burning under moderate fire weather still burns at high severity than intact unlogged forests burning under extreme fire weather conditions. So that's the extent of the effect. It's a really significant elevation of the problem. Okay, so when we start to look at the fire problem relative to the rest of the world, we see that Australia is actually not travelling well. So the red areas around the globe are the ones where we see a very substantial increasing burn trend. So Australia, South Africa, Madagascar, the US, Alaska, so mainland USA and Alaska, are all experiencing increasing trend. Now, this was published last year in 2023. The increasing trend has now moved from orange to red for Canada following the massive fires they've just had there this year, in addition to what's going on in the US. Now, if we look at the frequency of fire in places like Australia, one of the things we also see is that the amount of fire in the landscape is actually increasing in significant parts, not only in southeastern Australia, but particularly in northern Australia. So some parts of northern Australia have experienced up to 42 fires in the last 23 years. And that's way outside the natural range of variability we should see for fire frequency. But it's not just Australia. We're seeing this in Venezuela, Colombia, the southwestern margins of the Amazon, and parts of Africa as well, particularly around southern Sudan. So there's a big change in fire frequency. Now, another really important myth that relates to fire is that forests were open and park-like at the time of British invasion. And this idea comes from populist books like the one from Bill Gammage and a book co-written by Bill Gammage and Bruce Pascoe. And so what they've been saying is that our tall wet forests were open and park-like at the time of British invasion. They were farmed by First Nations people, and they were deliberately burned either through recurrent fire, cultural fire, or they were deliberately set alight through wildfire. And the implications of this kind of perspective are that we should be managing these tall wet forests by burning them regularly and thinning them extensively. So I'm a scientist and I need to look at evidence. And so we've looked at evidence of what forests were like at the time of British invasion. And we've looked at early explorers' testimonies, early paintings, early photographs, carbon dating, and also soil carbon from soil pits, dendrochronology or tree ring work, because when a forest burns, you can see the effect in the tree rings of trees that survive, basic analysis of the ecology of these forests, and also what we call LIDAR analysis, which is light intensive radar that allows you to look at the structure of forests. So when we look at early paintings, we don't see an open and park-like environment at all. It's actually quite dense and wet. Same with photographs, early photographs. This is from the Strzelecki Ranges. And if we look at First Nations testimonies, First Peoples, what they're saying is significant remnants of old growth forest are characteristic of a period when only the Gunai Kurnai people were present on the land. So this is from eastern and northeastern Victoria, a reminder to us of what our country was like in the time of our ancestors. I think it's also important to look at the testimonies of early expeditioners. Strzelecki, in his travels through eastern Victoria, steep hills and gullies covered with almost impenetrable forest. Human Hovel, talking about their encounters at Mount Disappointment on their trip from Picton to where Melbourne is now. The brushwood is so thick it's impossible to see before them in any direction. Now, this is probably why it was called Mount Disappointment. They tried 3 times to get to Mount Disappointment. Broadrib, in his travels in eastern Victoria, extremely dense forest, sheer impossibility of riding a horse in these places. Bill Gammage somehow has completely missed these important testimonies, and there are literally hundreds of them describing tall wet forests, wetter forests, foothill forests that are very similar to this. And the historical ecology is interesting because deliberate burning of these wet forests was very unlikely, particularly as these kinds of forests didn't provide a food source for Aboriginal people, a significant one. So the general conclusion from all of this is that tall wet forests, including in New South Wales, are naturally dense wet environments. They weren't regularly burnt. First Nations people call these forests no fire country. There is no evidence whatsoever that they were ever farmed by First Nations people, none. And they were not open and park-like. Now, this doesn't mean that these forests were wilderness. First Nations people did visit them. They did collect lyrebird feathers. They harvested the pith of tree ferns. They harvested the roots of plants like sassafras. So I think it's important to understand, though, that the dense wet environments that we're looking at in these kinds of forests throughout Eastern Australia are natural for those ecosystems. It's very important. So the management implications are really quite important here, because the suggestion that we should be doing widespread burning in them and extensive thinning, as the industry has proposed, is actually completely inappropriate for these kinds of forests. It's also important to understand that prescribed burning is not appropriate for these forests either. And what we understand is that logging, thinning, prescribed burning in these kinds of environments actually makes them more flammable, not less. And so the key way to manage these forests is to leave them alone. Let them grow through to an old growth stage, which is less flammable. Now, this is going to be a big issue because it's not easy to do that under rapid climate change, but we need to use new technologies to more rapidly detect ignitions, including lightning strike modelling and drones, and then use drones and unmanned aerial vehicles for rapid suppression while fires are still small. So this work on historical ecology has actually been published in Austral Ecology. And I should say at this point that if anybody wants to follow up with anything that's been talked about here, I'm more than happy to send you the papers and respond to questions that you might have. So the fourth myth that we hear regularly is that if we don't log forests, we'll be killing orangutans because we'll have to suck in imports from places like Borneo. I think it's really important to look at the structure of the industry. 90% of all the sawn timber in Australia already comes from plantations. 90% of timber cut from native forests goes to make wood chips, pulpwood, paper pulp for manufacturing paper, box liners, and packaging. The other bizarre thing is that up to 93% of our plantation eucalypt pulp logs are already being exported. Sometimes we have to buy them back as paper bags after they've been processed in places like China and Vietnam. We also know that in some places, for example, mountain ash, the world's tallest flowering plant, mostly wood chips, and it's being used to smoke pork bellies to go on Domino's pizzas. I kid you not. So we're not going to be importing wood chips from orangutan habitat. That's crazy. Most of our timber imports already come from Commonwealth countries like New Zealand and also parts of Europe and North America. But much of our sawn timber is actually Australian grown plantation softwoods. Another really important myth is that logging is a really important part of our economy. The reality is that when economic analyses are done, for example, by Frontier Economics, now Frontier Economics is not a left-wing consulting company. It's not PwC cash for comments. Frontier Economics is actually a very interesting company. You get what the answers are. You don't get what you pay for. These people do an analysis and they tell you what the answer is. And these people have shown quite clearly that native forest logging in Victoria, in Tasmania, and in New South Wales, particularly in New South Wales, is a major drain on the public purse. But to give you an example in a Victorian context, and it's more straightforward to look at it in Victoria because Victoria has a native forest logging agency, Vic Forests, and it has a separate entity, Hancock's, which does plantation timber. And so you can see the viability or otherwise of the native forest sector when it's partitioned like that. In New South Wales, it's much more difficult because the hardwood division and the softwood division are merged together and one cross-subsidises the other. So in a Victorian context, what we see is that, for example, in East Gippsland, an area that was feeding enormous amounts of timber to the Eden woodchip mill across the border, hadn't been profitable for years. So this is a document from 2014. So it hadn't been commercial for a decade at that stage. So that's dating back to 2004. So this is not unusual. This is actually seen all over the place. So we've actually looked at this in a Victorian context using economic and environmental accounting, and we see that the values of other natural resources, be it water supply, tourism, carbon, the plantation sector, are way, way higher than the native timber sector. Now, the native timber sector in this part of the world, in the Central Highlands, this is the epicenter of logging in Victoria, or it was until recently. Yet the native forest logging sector was still worth 25.5 times less than the water supply and 3 times less than the plantation sector. Plantations are very limited in this area, but still worth way more than the native forest sector. So in summary, the native forest logging sector everywhere is actually a major drain on the public purse. Tasmania, it's cost the taxpayer more than $1.3 billion. In Victoria, it's cost the taxpayer over $1 billion. And in New South Wales, it's likely to be well over $1 billion. And so these handouts to industry are everywhere, and they've gone on for many decades. And this has been demonstrated in many independent reports. You might be amazed to hear that there's been on average one inquiry into the native forest logging sector every year since the Second World War. Yet we're still doing it. So I think we need to rethink our strategy. You need to think about where you have your best and highest value. And in native forests, the best and highest values are for water and water production, carbon storage and tourism. And the best and highest value for plantations is wood products. And what the carbon research shows is it's best to source your wood from plantations because of the reduced emissions from plantations relative to native forests. And so we've started to think about this process of what diversifying forest management looks like by having a rapid transition from native forest logging to plantations. And really what we see from the economics, now this work isn't published yet, but the best transition given the churn in the workforce is about 2 years. That's the best transition in terms of return on investment and value for taxpayers' money. So the future of forestry, native forestry in Australia, is to exit the industry and manage those forests for biodiversity, fire, carbon, and water, to invest in your plantation sector, and to increase your focus on plantation design, because plantation design has a big effect on forests. Plantations are 4 times less likely to burn than native forests that are logged and regenerated, and we can reduce that effect of fire in plantations even more if they're well designed. Now, I think it's very important to think about formal protection as a fundamental strategy in forests. And we've been thinking about this in Victoria for some time through, for example, the Great Forest and now the Great Forest National Park. And I know that this is a big issue in New South Wales with the Great Koala National Park. If you don't do formal protection, you'll get the Tasmanian effect. And that was that environment groups were trying to be nice and accommodating, and they arranged a peace deal with the industry. And then with the change of government in Tasmania, the peace deal was torn up. A wood bank, quote unquote, was opened up, and now we're back to the forest wars. And some of those most important areas for conservation in Tasmania are now going to be targeted for native forest logging in that space. So there's a lot of work to do. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of is that the native forest logging industry has started to parasitize First Nations corporations. They've renamed logging forest gardening. Forest gardening is logging. And many First Nations people are very concerned about it because of the damage that it will do to the forest. I'm going to show you 2 photographs of forest gardening. Here's one, and here's another one. And if you can pick the difference between forest logging and forest gardening, then you're better than I am, because essentially there's no difference. And we know that many First Nations people are actually devastated when their forests are logged. So this is the Juri dancers. This is a group of Wurundjeri women. They're doing a sorry dance on log forests because logging forests is like killing their mother. I think there's a really important role for people to work with First Nations people in co-management of national parks. I've worked at Buderi National Park now for 23 years. I was there last week doing our bird counts in the park as part of monitoring for the Wreck Bay community and Parks Australia. And it's quite clear that there are co-management models that allow for good management and restoration of forests without logging them, without doing stupid things, inappropriate things that destroy country like forest gardening. There's still a lot of work to do in forests. It's still going to need a workforce. For example, throughout large parts of southeastern Australia, we're seeing failed regeneration after native forest logging. In large parts of southeastern New South Wales, what has happened as a consequence of the Eden woodchip concession zone and the extensive logging that's taken place there is that we are seeing forests that are dominated by silvertop ash. Silvertop ash is a fireweed. It's inedible for koalas and greater gliders. And so over 100 years of intensive logging that started in the 1920s in that southern part of New South Wales and spilled over into northeastern Victoria, those forests are dominated by silvertop ash, and they're essentially glider and koala deserts. So we are going to have to work really hard to recover animals like the greater glider. This animal used to be the most common species that we would see when we were doing our surveys in the 1980s. It's now endangered. It's very quickly gone from being one of the most common species to one of the rarest species. And so we have to do a lot of work, for example, with new generation nest boxes and artificial hollows to start to bring these animals back. So we are still going to need a workforce in the forest, just not knocking down the trees, but doing true restoration efforts if we're going to bring animals like the greater glider back from extinction, and we're going to reduce fire risks, and we're going to tackle problems like huge numbers of feral deer in the forest. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm also going to make a call out to another meeting at the Redfern Town Hall on the 30th of September, and that's a pathway out of native forest logging, and that's being held by the Australia Institute. And I think that's also a very important meeting. There is now a significant amount of momentum for people to start to think about making this exit from native forest logging. It's an important thing to do for the climate because we'll reduce our emissions. It's important for biodiversity. It's important for regional renewal, and it's important for the New South Wales economy. I'm going to leave it there and happy to start to take questions. I've talked for about 35 minutes. Jim, I hope that's, and others, I hope that's okay.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much, David. So if you'd like to put your hand up if you've got a question, but David, just to start you off, you've touched on politics on and off throughout the presentation, and we know that our politicians are key to identifying areas that can be used for extraction and also for protection. National Parks Association led the Great Koala National Park campaign, and we're really pleased to see that it was going to happen. But now they're in logging koala hubs and small coops whilst they're delaying a decision. So there is actually a question online from Dame Claire, who's heard that the Premier is holding back on the commitment to the Great Koala National Park as an intention to use native forests for carbon credits.
Yes, I have heard that too, and I think that's flawed. I think there are real dangers with carbon credits because what can happen here is that, and this is a concern in Tasmania as well, is that Forest Corp of New South Wales will get X tens of millions of dollars for carbon credits in some areas for not logging in some areas, but that will provide it with an income stream to keep logging in others. And I believe that there should be a complete moratorium on any logging in the Great Koala National Park area. I've seen this kind of thing happen before when conservation groups call out an area as being very important high conservation value forests, and then the forest industry targets its operations in those areas to degrade those forests, to be able to say, look, it's so degraded, there's no way that you'd want to have this as a national park. It's actually a tactic that's used.
Do you think it's something that could overturn their absolute commitment at the last election to establish it in this term?
They must establish it in this term. And I think it's totally cynical and inappropriate to keep logging it the way it is. I think it's not clear at all that a carbon methodology is going to work. I think it's important to account for the carbon in the forests when it's not logged, but you don't need to trade it. Otherwise, it's going to get gained, just like what is proposed in Tasmania. What's proposed in Tasmania is that there are going to be some areas that won't be logged that probably would never have been logged anyway. So they're going to attract carbon credits, and that will provide an income stream to Sustainable Timber Tasmania to keep logging elsewhere. And so that's a perverse subsidy. And we should not allow that because that will lead to more emissions, not less. And what we know is that when you log native forests, you generate large amounts of carbon emissions. So in Tasmania, the carbon emissions profile of that state is equivalent to about 1.1 million cars of emissions every year. So we need to stop native forest logging. We know if we stop land clearing and native forest logging in Australia, we will reach our 2030 emissions reduction targets. So that's appalling for Chris Minns to keep dragging his feet like this. And the only way he's going to change is if enough people put up their hands and protest. We know that Penny Sharp is waiting for people to push back and say this is inappropriate. The only way that politicians respond is when they're forced to. Politicians do not lead. Politicians follow, and politicians follow when enough people are pushing back and saying enough is enough.
Thanks, David. There's a question online from Connie.
My question is, in the Sydney area where we have certainly not, or where we have some tall forests a bit further west, but towards the coast, we have a non-tall forest, but we have some areas of old forest as well. So how do we have to see those? Because my observation is that the biodiversity actually really declines if it doesn't get burned for, I've got a block here, 20, hasn't been burned for 30 years, basically. What is your recommendation there?
Well, I'd have to see the specifics of the kind of forest you're talking about. Given how much fire there is in the landscape in most places now, what's really missing in large parts of southeastern Australia and northern Australia is long unburnt.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real problem. There is a secondary problem that goes with burning. Oh, well, there's several problems. The second one is that when forests are burnt, vegetation is burnt, the areas are targeted for hunting by feral animals. So feral animals will move more than a dozen kilometres up and further to target areas where there's been burning because of the removal of vegetation cover. It's a really significant issue. So in Buddaree National Park, when there's been wildfires, the immediate response from the park managers is to heavily poison bait the area because of the influx of foxes. And there's a very high bait take where populations of foxes are knocked down, and that's allowed populations of eastern bristlebirds and a whole range of other bird species to survive in the presence of fire. So given the amount of fire that we're seeing in most environments throughout Eastern Australia, adding even further fire to the fire burden is often a big problem. The third issue is that in many of these landscapes, forest landscapes, when you burn the vegetation, it stimulates a pulse of understory regrowth. So it doesn't kill the overstory trees, but rejuvenates the understory. But that actually means that there's a period of understory growth which is more flammable. And that creates what are called ladder fuels, which takes the flames from the ground level to the understory to the canopy, and then you've got a problem because you've got an overstory fire. If you want to follow up any of that, just send me an email and I'll send you some information on that.
David, just on that point, I might ask if it's okay for you if I distribute your email to everyone who's joined online.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Absolutely. So we'll send that out later. The next question on the chat relates to an issue that occurred here in Sydney on the weekend. We had some controlled burning, which quickly went out of control and burnt 50 hectares was the last report I saw. I don't know what the end result was. Actually down the road from Connie's place, who just asked that last question. So the question is that the Premier said that controlled burning of forest in urban areas is necessary, and Jim is asking, how do we change this mindset?
This is a vexed issue, so bear with me. It is true that prescribed burning does increase the flammability of some vegetation types. Okay, so it has a perverse effect. So the window for doing prescribed burning is now narrowing very quickly because of how dry climate conditions are becoming. And spring, when burns are done, are very dangerous because spring is typically very windy. Okay, so I think there's a role for new technologies. We've written about this, about using new technologies to detect fires quickly and suppress them quickly. Essentially, we're treating fire like it's the 1950s, not 2020. The issue with prescribed burning is that there are targets for a certain percentage. You know, we heard the head of the RFS saying, "Oh, we didn't get near our targets." many of those target areas are actually very remote. You know, remote parts of Coringo Chase, remote parts of the Blue Mountains, remote parts of Kosciuszko. That is highly ineffective. The reality is that we're trying to defend people's properties and people's lives. So that the general thinking is that prescribed burning has a small effect. It's significant, but it's small. So what we call the effect size is small. And it's best done very close to people's property, and it has to be done very often. But, you know, the record of prescribed burning getting away is actually increasingly prevalent. You know, lots of houses destroyed, for example, at Margaret River in Western Australia, lots of very important habitats for animals destroyed by prescribed burning. For example, 77% of the population of Western ringtail possums were killed a couple of years ago in a prescribed burn there that got out of control. So I think we need to rethink the notion of widespread prescribed burning. You are more likely to die from respiratory effects associated with prescribed burning than you are likely to die in a wildfire. That's the data. So there's an increasing presentation of people with respiratory complications during widespread prescribed burning. And we see that in the mortality rates of firefighters as well. They tend to die young, which is often the reason that they're able to take a pension much earlier than the rest of the population. So I think it's actually time to rethink what we're doing. In many cases, we're working against forests and other environments rather than working with what we call ecological controls on fire. There's a need to rethink this. And the other issue is that a lot of industrial scale prescribed burning is being done under the guise of this is what cultural burning looked like. I'm sorry, but no, cultural burning did not look like that. Cultural burning was very localized. My First Nations mentors that I've worked with extensively and on extensive projects tell me that cultural burning was done in very small areas with very, very low fire intensities, very low fire severities, and done for specific purposes to create green pick and to create tubers and other food plants and to clear very narrow walkways and pathways from point A to point B. So widespread industrial prescribed burning is not the same as cultural burning. It's very important to understand that crucial difference. And I think it's another form of adoption of inappropriate adoption of cultural IP in this area.
Thanks, David. Paula Richardson, I did see you had your hand up. Do you still have a question? If not, I'll go back online. So, David, one of the people on the chat has said that she writes to the minister every week.
Good.
And you mentioned the importance of politicians following and writing letters to our politicians is often one of those ways. Do they take any notice, or are there other ways that you think we should be addressing this issue?
Oh yeah, I think it's important that you get more and more people together to do this. I'm aware of people in Victoria and elsewhere that treated this, and in Tasmania, that treated these things as a social event. So they get together with a couple of bottles of wine and bring their laptops and write letters. And then not only email them, it's actually important to snail mail them as well. But also it's important to make your feelings known to your local representatives. They're supposed to represent you. And it's really important to engage in democracy in this way. Write letters to newspapers, because all politicians follow what comes out in media monitors. So write letters, make appointments with your local member, make appointments with your with senior politicians. Penny Sharp wants to hear what people are thinking. You know, the surveys that have been done indicate that 82% of Australians want the end of native forest logging. But what's happening is that politicians are stitched up by slick, clever lobbyists who are in Macquarie Street all the time. So it's important that people counter that in the democracy that we live in, to make sure that their voices are heard and that their feelings are known through all of those avenues. And so that's official letters through the NPA, but it's also through letters from individual citizens and groups of people getting together and pushing to see the change.
The next question might be a little bit pointed, but so we all know that the Nature Positive Summit is coming up, and Dame Claire would like to know if you've been invited.
Yes, I've been invited, but I'm not allowed to speak because I'm skeptical that it's going to achieve very much. I'm worried about it being gamed. I think it won't work unless there's really, really good monitoring. So everything that I've talked to tonight has been based on detailed long-term monitoring. And at the moment, the federal government is walking away from this saying, oh, we'll get a satellite to do it, or we'll let the farmers do it themselves. That's bullshit. You've got to have strong, independent, functional, transparently reported monitoring for this market to have any hope. Otherwise, it'll be gamed like the carbon market. You know, I think it's important for people to realise that at the moment, there's an area the size of Japan within Australia that has what's called human-induced regeneration, where apparently we're going to see large trees regrowing in Australia's deserts and in our rangelands. And significant numbers of carbon credits are being allocated to people through that scheme. It's totally flawed. It's been gamed. So we're going to open up 3 new coal mines. We're going to open up the Beetaloo Basin, the Scarborough gas fields, and then claim them as offsets through these dodgy carbon credit schemes. We don't need to trade carbon. We just need to exit some of these industries quickly. And if we don't get the architecture right in the nature repair market with the proper monitoring, the proper methods, then it will fail.
So next up, we've got Karen online.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to ask about what the engagement is with the campaign to act on the coming bird flu to Australia that's supposed to arrive this spring, and we're at the beginning of spring now. So I was wondering what the NPA and people involved with David are doing about this, because it's a very concerning and urgent issue, and if it's not acted upon, we will have the silent forest. So
yeah, it's not my area of expertise. More my wife's expertise as a wildlife vet. There are groups that are very concerned about this and have been talking about it. I think one of the important things in these kinds of problems is that most species are more likely to be resilient where they're dealing with fewer other stresses. Okay, so what that means is that places within protected areas that are well managed are much more likely to hold on to their biodiversity than places where populations have to deal with multiple stresses, being extra fire, higher fire severities, climate change, land clearing, logging, all those kinds of areas. And that's why parks are so important. And that's why it's so critical that groups like the NPA need to push so hard for things like the Great Koala National Park and the end of native forest logging, so that we can give biodiversity a chance to deal with some of these other stresses by not having to deal with the other things that are going to come at them.
Thanks, David. Next question was Pam. Pam, did you still have a question to ask?
Yep. I'm just wondering whether whether politicians, in your experience, pay attention to big marches and things like that, or is it more letters? I know there's a certain ratio of the number of letters to the number of population that they think are interested in a certain issue.
Personal letters, I think, are really important, and they create problems for public servants because they have to answer them.
Right.
If you send 2,000 postcards where somebody just signs it, that has less of an impact than if people get together and write targeted letters and make sure that your letters go to the Premier, to the Minister, to your local member. Make appointments to go and see your local member and say that, you know, if you want people to vote for you, then you need to advocate for what I think is important, because they've been elected as representatives of your electorate. I don't think there's any single one way that seems to kick over the fruit stand, but multiple ways to engage, you know, formal letters from the NPA, get together with other groups, WWF and others, and push that way. I know that there are some people that have actually bought my book and then written in it and sent it to their minister, or taken their book to see their local member. Now, I'm not saying that to sell books, because I don't take the royalties. The royalties go into a student fund. But it's just another way of being able to engage and say, come on, you know, you're elected. This is an important legacy. Now, most senior politicians, premiers, they think about their legacy some way into their term. So if you think about Steve Bracks as premier, his big legacy was protecting the Otway Ranges, and he says that now when I've talked to him. Bob Carr was national parks. Graham Richardson was tropical rainforests. So you've got to get to Chris Minns to talk to him about this. This will be your legacy if you don't knock the forest down in the interim. Now, the other thing is that there's an inquiry going on in New South Wales. Make sure that you engage with it. Get all of your members. You know, these kinds of groups have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very intelligent, coherent members. You know, you're the kinds of people that are going to be writing to ministers and others. So also engage in that process. Tell them you want proper protection. You don't want this national park thinned. You don't want it logged. You don't want it forest gardened. You want it properly protected. You're worried about koalas. You're worried about all these other species. You're worried about climate change. And you're going to have to be relentless. You know, I've had to live this for 42 years. Just ask my family that. But it's important. This is our contribution to the next generations. It's our contribution to your kids, my kids, your grandkids, your neighbours' kids, those kinds of things. They mightn't thank you for it, but they'll appreciate what an amazing place it is if we can hold on to some of these areas and make sure they're properly protected.
Thanks, David. Next up is another David Gallen.
Oh, hi, David. You're muted. David, you're muted.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations on your book, and you'll be pleased to know NPA's got an ambitious 400,000 hectare aim to turn our south coast native forests into national park reserves.
Great, fantastic.
That's what we're working on currently. And NCC and NPA are writing submission guides for the independent inquiry. So that's in train, so people can write those sorts of letters you've mentioned. Just one thing that's occurred to me, your work and other researchers' work have really demonstrated well the importance of hollows and how long they take to form, you know, 150, 200 years for really large hollows. Something that I've been filming lately with gliders, yellow-bellied gliders feeding in blossoms, and noticing the really big trees have a really large production of blossoms. That's something I think that's not well known, and I'd just like to know a little bit about research. Maybe you could send me something about that, because if we're turning the forests into less biodiverse and younger forests, then we're going to lose that nectar supply as well.
That's right. So there is some work that shows that bigger trees produce more flowers, more pollen, more nectar, more seeds. So large old trees have a slightly different growth pattern to humans. So we have this period where we're teenagers, and then we're reproductive, and then we're a long period of senescence. And the important thing here is that trees, so we produce fewer young as we get very old, unless you're Charlie Chaplin. What happens in trees is that as you get older and older, you divert more and more of your energy away from growth and into reproductive structures like flowers, pollen, nectar, those kinds of things. So there's work on that. If you send me an email, I'll send you the paper. But you're exactly right. Very large trees are crucial, not just for hollows, but for their role in flower production, peak flowering, prolonged periods. Bigger trees tend to flower for longer than smaller trees. So they not only have more inflorescence, but they have a longer period for greater levels of pollen and nectar, those kinds of things. So there's probably also a relationship for yellow-bellied gliders that very, very big trees often seem to have higher sap flows for some of the things that yellow-bellied gliders are tapping into. And it's not right across the board, but certainly that's more of an anecdotal observation. Send me an email, I'll send you some papers on that stuff.
Thank you.
So, David, I think we're about at time. There's no more online and no hands up. So maybe if I just ask the last question that's kind of burning in my mind. Most of the people on the call are from the Sydney area, but we have opened it up to all National Parks Association members across Australia, and we kind of capped out at 100. Once we'd done that, it got very wide very quickly, a lot of interest in what you're talking about. But here in Sydney, we're also very interested in marine protection for very similar and parallel reasons to what's happening in the forest. There's a lack of sufficient protections in place now, and there is also regressive decisions being made by politicians in this particular area. So one of the things that we know is that academics in this space, I'm talking marine, I'm going to ask you about your area in forests. Academics are very knowledgeable. Most of the best ones work for government, but they're reluctant to speak out for what they're seeing, A, because of ongoing employment, and B, because of funding, given that academics largely work based on projects that are funded by government. So is it a similar issue for you in your field and your peers and colleagues that there is a widespread interest in doing a change of the type that you're talking about, but most people just feel like they're not able to speak out?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I'm in a position where I can speak out because I'm old, I'm blonde, I'm grumpy, and it's the right thing to do. I'm at a university. My previous vice-chancellors have been very supportive and allow me to say things as long as I've got the science and or the economics to back up what I'm saying. I know that younger academics are very vulnerable because they can't get funding. I know that I've lost lots of funding. I've been unsuccessful because I've been very outspoken about things, but and it's impossible for people that work for CSIRO or for government to actually say anything. So that means that it's even more important for the people that are prepared to speak out to do so. So that is a big issue. It's not a true democracy when you're a scientist that works for government, and that is a problem. But I think that's even more important for those of us who can speak out to do so. And that's the reason why I wrote the book. It wasn't an easy book to write. It's a very grumpy book. But the thing at the end is that there's actually a solution to the other end. We can manage our forests better. We can create regional and rural renewal. We can tackle the climate change problem. We can tackle the biodiversity problem. We can create new economies based on nature. And so that's actually an important good news story. So I think as part of the discussion with politicians, I think it's very important for groups like yours and others to paint a picture of somewhere better that we can go and create that pathway. Politicians tend to be very conservative to keep doing what they've always done because that's kind of the path of least resistance. But if there is a way to promulgate the way forward as something better, then eventually you get more and more people on board. Now, I also think it's really important to connect with other events like this. So the pathway out of native forest logging, that's the Australia Institute one. I think if we build up a critical mass of enough people across enough lobby groups, I think it'll make a difference. Politicians can ignore 50 people or 100 people, but if you get thousands of people demanding a change, then things change. And that's what happened in Victoria. Now, in Victoria, logging's coming back in more sinister forms, but people are now aware about it, about forest gardening and massive fire breaks and all sorts of rubbish like that. But this is the power of the people. And it's really important to reclaim this environment space. We had lots of good outcomes in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. It's time to revisit that. It's important for the country.
David, I think on that point, thank you very much.